Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Mr. Volker Türk, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is in Malaysia for a 3-day mission to the country. Commissioner Türk, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. If I may start our conversation here with a two-part question. And I want to begin with Gaza, because that's on a lot of Malaysians' minds. Gaza witnessed severe human rights violations during this most recent escalation of violence. And I think many people are increasingly skeptical about the UN's effectiveness in addressing some of those human rights violations. Can I ask you, the first part of the question is, what concrete actions are your office taking to address these violations? And how do you respond to critics who argue that the UN is no longer an effective body?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's really important to know that my colleagues on a daily basis risk their lives to actually help Palestinians, despite the extremely precarious, catastrophic circumstances. We had over 200 colleagues who lost their lives over the last couple of months. So when there is this idea that the UN is not doing enough, we are actually doing our utmost within what we can do to avert the worst, both when it comes to humanitarian action. But it is also true that humanitarian action at the moment is extremely difficult. We have not had the type of response from Israel that we need. We haven't had the type of response that is required in order to deliver aid to the people inside Gaza. My office itself, our role is to document, to monitor the situation, and to report.
Have you been able to go into Gaza yourself?
I have not been able to go to Gaza. I've only been able to go to the border because Israel did not grant me entry. So
Israel did not grant the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights entry into Gaza.
I could not go, yeah. So that shows you also the difficulty that we face.
What are the limits of the UN's ability to help the people of the occupied Palestinian territories?
So for us, it's extremely important that we continue saying what is going on. We need to tell the world what is going on, and you probably have seen my statements ever since the start. We have been extremely clear about what is going on. Also, as a result, triggering discussions in different capitals around the world about what is happening and what needs to happen. And it's absolutely clear that those countries that have influence both over Israel but also over Hamas need to act, because the most important thing that we need is ceasefire on humanitarian grounds, because people are suffering on a daily basis. I think what shocks us so much is that the suffering of Palestinians who haven't been able to even find shelter properly anymore, who haven't been able to have access to water, who haven't been able to have access to food that is meaningful, they are suffering on a daily basis. I talked to some of my staff, some of my national staff, one of whom told me, my wife is pregnant, 7 months pregnant, I don't know where she's going to give birth. So that's the reality of people. And it is absolutely critical that those countries that have influence over both parties use that influence to come to a ceasefire.
How do you think this most recent global spotlight on Gaza, and we see this being streamed into our phones on a daily basis, how do you think that's affected the discourse of human rights, about human rights globally, just based on your observations?
So I think there are those who think that human rights has failed, and there are those who think we need even more of human rights. We need more awareness, we need more mindfulness, we need to take seriously what human rights is doing and saying. My first reporting on this as High Commissioner was last year, before the 7th of October. I warned about what is happening, even then.
Right.
And I have to say, we're sometimes sleepwalking into disasters, and not just in the case of Gaza, but also in the case of Myanmar. So human rights actually need to be taken much more seriously for the world to wake up and to do something about it. And that's really the message. We need more of human rights rather than less.
To the people who think human rights have failed, the first batch that you mentioned, what would you say to them?
You need to learn more about what human rights has actually achieved. A lot of our lives today would be unthinkable had the human rights movement not taken on its strong force. Decolonization is a human rights movement. The fact that we have gotten rid of colonies in most parts of the world is a result of human rights. The fact that we don't have an apartheid regime anymore in South Africa is a result of human rights. The fact that women, feminism is a human rights movement. The fact that, you know, there were parts in Europe where women could not vote, in parts of Europe, in the 70s or in the 60s of the last century. It's not even, today you cannot even imagine this.
That's recent.
But that was human rights.
Okay. Right.
And I think we need to know that human rights sometimes takes time. It's not happening from one day to the next, but it is always the struggle for freedom, and it's the struggle for respecting each and every human being in their dignity and rights. And we all have these equal rights, everyone in the world.
Okay. So it's 75 years since the Declaration of the Human Rights. So, and I also have noticed that it's about 80 years, the UN is going to be celebrating 80 years.
Next year.
80 years of establishment next year.
Yeah.
However, there have been comments about the structure of this body, that it does not reflect contemporary realities. 80 years ago, a lot of the member states were under colonial rule. There's been calls for reform of the UN Security Council. And I wanted to ask you, how loud are those voices calling for reform, and how well are those calls being received?
Yeah. So we actually have a very important summit this year. It's a leaders summit. It's called the Leaders Summit of the Future. So all the leaders will come to New York in September, and they will have in front of them a pact for the future, meaning what is effective multilateralism meaning in the 21st century. And it will also, hopefully, I mean, it's among member states, they will have to negotiate it, but it will also tackle the issue of the Security Council reform. It will tackle the issue of the fact that the General Assembly, which is the organ within the UN where everyone participates, including, of course, Malaysia, my own country, Austria, by the way, which is a much smaller country, and we have a say and we have a right to vote. And that's incredibly important. Of course, there are many issues today that were not thought about 80 years ago. For instance, the whole digital development. You know, we have generative artificial intelligence today. So there is a need to come back to what actually needs to be done to have a better governance system. Governance meaning, how do you regulate generative AI so that it can do very good, but that we can also prevent the harms from happening. Then there is the whole question of future generations climate change. I mean, we have a triple planetary crisis. Climate change, I mean, I noted even 20 years ago, I remember Malaysia much cooler than it is today. In the last couple of days, I noticed the temperatures have gone up. The same in Europe. I mean, it's incredible how the temperature, we already feel the effect of climate change.
Every year is the hottest year on record.
Every year is the hottest year on record. And it means that this is going, it's a ticking time bomb. So we need to address it as humanity, and for that you need the UN, because it's the only global convening power that exists.
So you still see relevance of multilateralism today. I want to know, what is the biggest threat to the UN's relevance today?
The biggest threat is that it's not taken seriously enough by some leaders. And it has to be taken more seriously, because it's the only institution that we have that can tackle the biggest problems of our time. And the other big issue is it has to have more teeth. It has to be given more teeth. We have some teeth. The Security Council has a lot of power, but you have also seen how dysfunctional the Security Council has become. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to the crisis of today, they are not necessarily on Ukraine, they couldn't agree. On Gaza, they can hardly agree. There was one Security Council resolution, but it's not enough. So in order to resolve conflict, that's where the Security Council was established. We have 55 conflicts today in today's world. So it means that people are suffering on a daily basis, And we need the institutions that were set up precisely to deal with these issues to be effective.
I can understand that reforms don't happen overnight, especially to such behemoth organizations like the United Nations. But what is at risk if nothing changes? Could the UN suffer a fate similar to the League of Nations? Could multilateralism disintegrate because it hasn't fulfilled its mandate of equal rights for everyone?
Yeah. I think the world has no choice but to make multilateralism or international cooperation, to use another word, much more effective. If you look at climate change, you know, let's go back to COVID, because COVID is much more interesting. COVID meant a little minute virus brought the world to its knees. And it was a virus that didn't know that it didn't have a passport, it just crossed the border, right? There was no border control, no law enforcement, because a virus is a virus. So it affected the whole world. It affected the poorest, it affected the most vulnerable. It equalized everyone, both in terms of countries. Of course, those countries with higher income, those countries who embraced sustainability, those countries who embraced also human rights were doing much better than those countries who didn't. That's also quite interesting. But what it taught us, that you need actually a health system worldwide that warns you about pandemics, possible pandemics, that actually finds a solution that puts the energy together so that a vaccine can be found, that treatment can be found, that you have all the scientists of the world can come together. So actually, for each of these big issues, like pandemic preparedness, pandemic response, you need international cooperation. The same, by the way, with climate change. Climate change cannot be tackled by one country alone. It has to be tackled by everyone. And that's where effective multilateralism comes in. But it also requires political leadership.
It does require political leadership. It also requires the buy-in of the masses. And I wanted to talk to you about multilateralism in the age of growing distrust in public institutions, growing disenfranchisement, growing polarization, lack of agency amongst people, and all that with the growing conflicts that you talked about, the climate crisis, these disruptive technologies. Where are the shortcomings that persist within the spaces that we talk about with multilateralism that require a concerted effort if we don't get the buy-in of the mass movement?
Yeah. You know what is interesting? There are a couple of big opinion surveys that were done around the world, including the Edelman, Pew Research, and a couple of others, including we did our own with the Open Society Foundation. The trust barometer for international institutions like the UN is much higher than for national governments.
Wow.
Yeah. And that is, I also was surprised. By the way, when it comes to human rights, if you talk to young people and if you survey young people in opinion polls and surveys, what would you think are their biggest challenges? Climate change, of course, but also human rights. They care about human rights. And it gives us an indication that people out there care more about the type of issues that we stand for as the United Nations, which is values, which is principles, which is standards, than one might think. Sometimes it brings us into conflict with governments. Because sometimes governments try to do different things that are not necessarily in line with the global agenda. And then they will use different arguments why you shouldn't trust. And they always say we are the elite. Well, we are not the elite. We are actually very grassroots. But sometimes it's to throw sand in the eyes.
Why is there that perception that the UN is this elite body made up of the richest people in the world? There is that perception.
There is that perception,
but
the
UN holds the highest seat of power in the world, essentially.
Well, frankly, we don't have power. We wish we could have more power. We don't. But also, I think there is well, first of all, it's a very wrong thing because, you know, I look at myself. I've worked in war zones. I've worked in humanitarian action around the world. I've seen how my old colleagues have been under extremely dangerous circumstances, but also because of a service to people. So this has got nothing to do with being in an elite. And I think people sometimes forget that we actually are out there to do the type of work that probably no one else wants to do. But we are also, of course, having to negotiate parameters, treaties, standards, and we have to push for the implementation of them.
How do you continue to do the work that you do in the age of a rise of the anti-rights movement? We've been seeing that in recent years, and there's more kind of anti-rights voices in human rights spaces. How do you do your work in human rights in this age?
Yeah, we need to continue doing the right thing. We need to continue constantly reminding people, educating people, also showing them what the advantages are of human rights, that they have all given us. Our lives would be unthinkable without human rights. And we need to bring this more down to the basic level. Education. There is a right to education, that actually people have a right to primary education, to secondary education, is part of human rights. You know, if people don't have that right, you know what I mean? We won't have a future for ourselves, for our children. So it's important to bring it back to the basics. It's also important to explain, and it is important to show what was behind these values and principles. And what I sometimes see in those who want to distract, it's often misinformation. It's also a lot of ignorance, and it's prejudice. And it's important to educate. And I think, media also play an important role to help educate people about, what are the advantages of human rights, and what has it brought us.
To ask you, how do we broaden that conversation? I know the media plays an important part, but in Malaysia, for instance, discussions around human rights tend to be concentrated in urban liberal circles, liberal progressive circles. How do we broaden this dialogue to ensure that we include and engage other communities, other demographics who may view human rights as a Western-centric agenda?
Yeah, it's key to invest in human rights education. I heard from Suhakam, from the National Human Rights Commission here. They told me that they have invested a lot in human rights, and they work with the Ministry of Education. I think there are now over 600 schools where you have a program on human rights education, and that is really key. In fact, investment in human rights education is absolutely critical, because it doesn't matter whether it's in urban or in rural areas. It should happen in the kampong as it should happen in KL or in
But how do we
Malacca.
ensure that human rights is seen as a universal value, as opposed to something that's being externally imposed?
Yeah. If you go into the actual substance of human rights, you will see that it has foundations in each and every religion, in each and every culture, in each and every social, political entity. So we know that there are homegrown traditions of human rights that would immediately reject any suggestion that this is coming from somewhere else. And frankly, for me, the most basic thing is, torture, the right not to be tortured, the prohibition of torture, which is a fundamental human right. Some people would say, well, I remember even at some stage it got questioned during a certain period, even by countries in the West, until you actually realize torture. Who wants to be tortured in this world? No one wants to be tortured. It doesn't matter whether you are coming from Europe or from Latin America or from Southeast Asia. I mean, torture is so fundamental to our human dignity that it has to be prohibited. And everyone in the world would agree that torture is unacceptable. So that shows you how universal it is. And the same for water, right to water. Who would argue that you shouldn't get water?
I think
because it's for our survival.
Very often we forget the first part of human rights, which is human. And it applies to everyone.
Exactly, it applies to everyone. And it's also sometimes there is a reduced vision of human rights. Human rights is economic, social, cultural, civil, political, environmental, and development. So it covers, frankly, it covers the interaction between human beings. It covers the interaction, how we deal with the state, how the state deals with us, but also how we interact with the environment, with nature. So it really covers our life.
It's quite all-encompassing.
Yeah.
Speaking of the state, I have to ask you that you are in town, and during your visit here, you've met with several people. You've met with the Prime Minister, you've met with senior officials of the government, you've met with human rights defenders, you mentioned Suharkamde earlier, civil society, migrants, refugees. Through all of your discussions and conversations with all of these people, what have you learned about the state of human rights in Malaysia? What's your essential assessment of the state here in Malaysia?
Yeah. Well, also looking back at my time when I lived
Yes, well,
here,
you have a point of comparison.
Yes, I have a point of comparison. I mean, a lot has happened. And a lot has happened towards a much more open Malaysia than ever before. Of course, it doesn't mean that things are perfect. They are not, of course. Nobody is perfect. There's no country in the world that isn't perfect. That is perfect. So I think that's also important. But what I've seen is really a vibrant civil society. I have met with refugee communities from Myanmar, for example, where in the past you would only meet with one of the leaders. Now I've seen more social cohesion among the refugee and migrant communities. So there is almost solidarity among them, but also with Malaysians. I've seen the most engaged Malaysian activists who have opened their hearts to people and to migrants, to foreigners, to my refugees, and I think that's beautiful to see. Of course, and I have seen, I was very happy to hear about the recent. I spoke to the Minister for Women and Community Development earlier today, and was very happy to see this very active engagement by Malaysia with the review by the Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, so which is really an important aspect of human rights work. Where you get reviewed as a state by an expert committee, and they ask you all kinds of questions, and they show you where there is progress, but they also point out what needs to be done, what are the gaps, and that's really great. And it's good to see this engagement on Malaysia's part.
So, but what more can we do? What more can Malaysia do to further our ability to protect and uphold human rights here?
So I think you have a big chance coming up. That's the ASEAN chair next year, 2025. And Malaysia comes at a time when you take over Malaysia takes over the chair at a time when there is this visioning exercise going on for 2045. I mean, it's 20 years. How does ASEAN develop the future of, it's a future thinking of ASEAN. It's really important that human rights is integral to all of this, and that sustainable development, Southeast Asia more generally, is seen also from a human rights lens. Because sometimes sustainable development is seen as one thing and human rights as another. But to be honest, it goes hand in hand. And I hope that Malaysia can play a key role in advancing this and bringing human rights and sustainable development together.
Well, hopefully when you come back again, you'll have another point of comparison, and progress will have been made. Thank you so much, Commissioner, for speaking with me today.
Thank you very much.
Your time.
Terima kasih.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.